The views expressed in this course are those of the professor and do not necessarily reflect the position or policy of the teaching company LLC, the U.S. Naval War College, the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Department of Defense, or the U.S. government.
The Sun Tzu's global popularity revolves around two somewhat contradictory propositions. The first is that the book represents the concentrated essence of universal strategic wisdom. The second is that it represents a uniquely Chinese or maybe Asian strategic mindset. The latter is what academics call Orientalism, essentializing an Asian other as an alter ego to the West. It's an old phenomenon. It dates back at least to the Greek historian and traveler Herodotus. Herodotus exaggerated Persian virtues and vices, such as their distaste for dishonesty, a virtue, to warn Greek readers about their own propensity to lie. An Orientalist approach to the Sun Tzu has resulted in both negative and positive stereotypes of what we might think of as a Chinese strategic culture, viewed as the antithesis of the Western way of war. To me, the Sun Tzu is neither of these two things. It's not the concentrated essence of wisdom on the conduct of war. It's a great book, and we should read it and debate it, but it's far from the only great book on strategy. Nor is it the be-all and end-all of Chinese strategic culture, if there is such a thing. War and strategy across the vast sweep of Chinese history was a dynamic and chaotic enterprise, as prey to the fog, friction, chance and probability, genius and stupidity as war in any other civilization. Regardless, when translating the Sun Tzu into a Western context, many interpreters have hewed to one of these two approaches. Moreover, the text's attractiveness to foreign audiences has often depended on China or Asia's relative strategic position. For example, during the 18th century Enlightenment, intellectuals admired China for its political stability, its military power, and the impression that generals in China were, in stark contrast to Europe, formally educated. In the 19th century, the Sun Tzu and Chinese strategic culture were more broadly interpreted as evidence of Chinese inferiority, demonstrated by the undeniable, it was thought, success of the concept of the Western way of war, and the contrast between Western dynamism and modernity and Asian passivity and backwardness, where, in their minds, hapless ancient civilizations clinging to fossilized anachronisms, right? Like reading 2,000-year-old books about crossbows and chariots in an age of machine guns and battleships. But in the mid-20th century, which saw both Mao Zedong's victory in the Chinese Civil War and the birth of modern strategic studies, the Sun Tzu became a global classic. Today, it's both a universal touchstone and a source of interest to those trying to understand Beijing's strategic inclinations. We'll be covering all that in this and subsequent lectures. But let's start with our text's early influences outside of China. Given the Sun Tzu's status in imperial China, and the fact that classical Chinese served across East Asia, much as Latin did in pre-modern Europe, the Sun Tzu's fame spread first and most significantly to medieval Korea, Southeast Asia, and especially Japan. All those states borrowed heavily from China. In Japan, the Sun Tzu first appears around 900 CE, and by the 11th century, it's widely quoted in military manuals. One famous disciple was the 16th century warlord Takeda Shingen. Takeda had the Sun Tzu's four-character phrase, wind, forest, fire, mountain, emblazoned on his battle standards. Be as swift as the wind, as yielding as the forest, as destructive as fire, and as immovable as a mountain. Then there was Natori Masataki's 17th century ninja manual, the Shōninki. That book offered an extensive elaboration on Sun Tzu's insights into espionage. For some samurai, however, the art of war's anti-heroic and frequently amoral approach ran counter to their cultural ethos. One aphorism from the Tokugawa period states that while the Sun Tzu is important, a true warrior reads the Wu-Tzu. Not surprising given the Wu-Tzu's emphasis on heroism and morality. In the 19th and 20th centuries, even as Japan increasingly emulated Western military models, Sun Tzu and Wu-Tzu remained required reading for officers. Chinese texts were embraced as essential to preserving a Japanese national character in a rapidly changing world. But that embrace was selective. Because given Japan's relative isolation and the book's very elusive nature, it was easy for interpreters to twist its meanings. In particular, its emphasis on intelligence, surprise, and deception became embedded in the new Japanese strategic culture of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. When those strategic instruments served sound policy, Japan was massively successful. We see this in both the Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War at the turn of the 20th century. But by the 1940s, deception and surprise had become ends in themselves. Pearl Harbor, a brilliant example of operational deception and surprise, but one that had catastrophic strategic consequences for Japan. But it was during that earlier Russo-Japanese War that we discover our book's first English language translation. Everard Ferguson Calthrop, a British Army officer who'd arrived in Japan just a month after Admiral Togo's brilliant surprise attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur, began studying Japanese as a member of the British Embassy in Tokyo. Looking at the Russo-Japanese War and the action that followed, he watched as this tiny island nation, barely a generation out of self-imposed isolation, crushed Russian forces on land and at sea. A rising power humbling a major Western power. One key to Japan's success was the wholesale adoption of the latest Western military technology and tactics. But Calthrop was curious about other secrets to that success. So with help from his language teacher, Calthrop started translating Sonshi no Heiho, Sun Tzu Bingfa. That's Sun Tzu Bingfa in Japanese. Having heard the Chinese classic was esteemed by Japan's senior military leadership, even more than works by Europe's best strategic mind. Calthrop's efforts, however, to make the text accessible to his fellow officers, while noble, was largely unsuccessful. For one, his translation's not particularly good. He was adept at languages, but he'd been in Japan for less than 2 years when he translated this book. And he was working from a colloquial Japanese translation. Now, that translation retains much of the kanji, the Chinese characters, from our original, but Calthrop had studied neither Chinese language nor Chinese history. In terms of selling the book, to make matters worse, Calthrop's British Army comrades, like many Western officers at the time, were fundamentally anti-intellectual, and they were generally uninterested in Oriental musings on strategy. When Calthrop was killed at Ypres in the First World War in 1915, a war that violated everything Master Sun teaches, his efforts to popularize the book died with him. It would take another world war and a bloody revolution to generate sufficient interest in Asian military thought for Sun Tzu to gain purchase. But before we get to that, let's turn the clock back to the 18th century and the European Enlightenment. A tantalizing moment when the Sun Tzu very nearly transformed Western strategic thinking. The two pivotal characters in this drama are Jean-Joseph Marie Amiot, a French priest assigned to the Jesuit mission in China, and Henri Bertin, the French controller of finance and later Secretary of State under Kings Louis XV and XVI. A decade ago, I would have noted Amiot as the first European translation of Sun Tzu before quickly moving on, thinking him a curious footnote in the book's history. But thanks to recent scholarship, however, I realized that would have been totally wrong. Arriving in Beijing in 1750, Father Amiot spent 4 decades at the interface between two empires at a pivotal moment in the political, intellectual, and military history of both Asia and Europe. Amio was a vital cross-cultural conduit, thanks to his personal connections. For one, Amio developed a close relationship with a Manchu prince named Hongwu. He was cousin of the Qianlong emperor. Hongwu shared Amio's interest in electricity and hot air ballooning. Exploiting Western science and technology was classic Jesuit strategy to cultivate foreign elites. These connections would prove particularly critical when the Society of Jesus was abolished by the Vatican in 1773. That the Jesuits continued to operate in China for decades after that purge was a remarkable feat. Amio had equally high levels of contacts in Paris. Chief among them was Bertin. In practical terms, Minister Bertin saw good trade and healthy diplomatic relations with the Qing Empire, the dominant power in East Asia, as crucial to French imperial interest. As such, corresponding with French Jesuits in Beijing was both good strategy and an excellent source of intelligence for Bertin. Bertin was also a reformer. He was trying to bring stability and prosperity to France. And like many Enlightenment figures, Bertin admired the Chinese Empire for its longevity and its system of enlightened despotism. Qing China was a vast empire governed by a relatively small cadre of classically educated mandarins. And unlike China of the 19th century, the 18th century Qing dynasty was a military superpower, its armies having recently conquered modern Xinjiang province. Bertin was eager to learn about Qianlong's armies as they might be worth emulating, and because the emperor might one day either prove an ally or an adversary. Although no soldier himself, Amio became an expert on the Qing military and its military education system, including the 7 military classics, gathering intelligence and relaying it back to Bertin in Paris. The effects of this exchange were not always salutary. At one point, Amio's patron used his Jesuit contacts to convey warnings to Qianlong regarding Russian designs on Central Asia. Bertin, too clever by half, couched his warnings in what he'd learned about the Sun Tzu's appreciation for espionage and deception, alerting Beijing to Russia's clandestine operations near Xinjiang and labeling them a significant threat to recent Qing conquests. Bertin was making the same mistake that many people do today, especially when it comes to China, assuming that reading Sun Tzu grants some kind of secret insight into the Chinese strategic mind. Bertin's advice was most unwelcome. The Manchus saw it as meddlesome arrogance, and the Jesuits urged Bertin not to involve them in any future efforts along these lines. They feared that Qianlong would retaliate against them and expel them from China. Back to Father Amio. Chinese is a really challenging language, and classical Chinese even more so. As a result, Amio struggled to render the Sun Tzu into serviceable French. Fortunately, he'd learned Manchu while working with Prince Hongwu. Manchu uses an alphabet, and alphabetic languages are much easier to learn than those using ideographs, pictographs, etc. As we've seen, the Qing had had many of the Chinese military texts translated into Manchu, and they retained them in their officer education curriculum. Those Manchu versions were Amio's shortcut to deciphering classical Chinese. But they're far more loquacious than the terse original text. For example, if we look at the first line from the original, my translation, Sun, the master, said, military, the state's greatest affair. Death and life's terrain, survival and ruin's path. Not cannot examine. It must be examined. Now, Amio's translation. Sun Tzu says, troops are the principal concern of the state, or in French, la grande affaire d'un état. It is on them that the life and death of the subjects depend, and the enlargement or the decadence of the empire. Not to reflect seriously upon what concerns them, not to work at directing them, is to show too much indifference toward the safekeeping or for the loss of what we must hold dear. And this is something that must not happen in our midst. Wow. Nor is it clear that Amio was sticking strictly to the Manchu Chinese version he had on hand, or was adding some of his own exposition. Nonetheless, Amiot realized that the book's plain-spoken practicality made it a potential primer for this alien language, especially since the subjects, war and strategy, were universal. As I've done myself, Amiot compared the Sun Tzu to Caesar's crisp commentaries on the Gallic Wars. He says, why should one not learn to read Manchu by studying the commentaries written to train Manchu Caesars? And as one might expect from a French Enlightenment priest, Amiot also imbued his Sun Tzu with his own humanist and classicist inclination. To Amiot, Master Sun was a supremely rational commander, engaged in the systematic study of his profession, a military intellectual who saw his role as benefiting the state he served. So during the 1760s, Amiot sent Bertin manuscripts of the Sun Tzu, the Wu Tzu, and the Sima Fa, 3 of the 7 military classics, along with sketches, diagrams, and other explanatory material on the Qing military. The compendium was edited by Joseph Deguin, France's preeminent Asia specialist, and published in 1772 as Art militaire des Chinois. Art militaire was a sensation. Leading French thinkers drew on the wisdom of Master Sun for ammunition to push desperately needed reforms through the bloated, poorly led, and poorly paid Bourbon military. It would be a much improved French army, further transformed by the Revolution, that Bonaparte would later command with such brilliance. It's unclear whether Napoleon read Amiot's translation, but as a graduate of the same military education system that was energized by those earlier reformers, the young Corsican was likely influenced, if only indirectly, by Art militaire. More importantly, however, was the profound, albeit subtle, influence that Amiot's Sun Tzu had on the modern concept of strategy. Strategy is a promiscuously applied term. I've used it liberally in this course. But while it has ancient roots, its modern definition and popularity traces to this exact moment in history. As Deguin was editing Art militaire, Paul Gédéon Joly de Mézerolle was working on a translation of his own ancient text. That text was the Tactica, compiled for the Byzantine Emperor Leo VI around 900 CE. Finding modern inspiration in the classics was central to the Enlightenment, and especially to the military Enlightenment, a parallel movement of soldier scholars, a rare breed at the time, drawing contemporary lessons from ancient wars. Fortunately, the Byzantines had preserved many Greek and Latin military classics, of which Leo's Tactica was a compilation, ready for rediscovery by the likes of Mézerolle. These classics offered both tactical and operational and strategic lessons and a common vocabulary for an emerging military profession. But one term from the Tactica that Mézerolle was struggling with was strategia, derived from strategos, Greek for leader of an army. In ancient Athens, a strategos was an elected statesman, right? A statesman elected to command the city's army. Mézerolle saw something in that merging of political and military roles, but had trouble creating a French noun for what it was that a strategos did. His first attempt was stratégique, which he described as art of the general. That was too vague and unsatisfying. Reading Amiot's translation, however, solved the problem. Mézerolle's new term, stratégie, was the science of the general. As he said, a deep, vast, sublime science which incorporates many others, the basis of which is military tactics, but that extends upwards into the realms of statecraft. So it's a realm of expertise incorporating all instruments of national power, diplomacy, economics, information, intelligence, and the military. And as a science, mastering it requires systematic study. This is the same concept of strategy that I teach my War College students today. And Mézerolle's inspiration was Amiot's elegant turn of phrase, la grande affaire d'un état, the state's greatest affair, the supreme form of statecraft. So hiding in plain sight, albeit buried in Mazerol's notes, is proof of the Sun Tzu's profound, but until just recently, unappreciated impact on modern strategic thought. So this Enlightenment belief that universal truths could be found in the classics, regardless of their national origin, that was what inspired Amiot to translate and Bertin to publish China's strategic classics. That same assumption convinced Mazerol that a warring state's text offered answers to the problems confronting 18th century France. In the 19th century, however, Enlightenment universalism and European admiration for China would fade. Imperialism's high tide came with an unabashed belief in Western superiority over Asian inferiority. It also saw China brought low in what the Chinese today refer to as the century of humiliation. In that context, few saw value in a 2,000-year-old text, much less one still on the curriculum of a moribund has-been like the Qing dynasty. But there was one intrepid British scholar, Lionel Giles, that did see value in it, and in part to correct the mistakes he saw in the Calthrop and Amiot editions, Giles published his own translation in 1910. The complete Giles, including the preface and the paired Chinese and English language versions, is a stunning work of scholarship. Not surprising, given that Giles was the first master of both classical Chinese and Chinese history to translate our text into English. He was keeper of the Department of Oriental Manuscripts and Printed Books collection at the British Museum, and he was the son of Britain's leading China expert, so his credentials were impeccable. But Giles was also a product of his times. He deeply admired China and this text, and he went to extraordinary lengths to argue that the Sun Tzu was deeply influential in China and essentially defined Chinese thinking on war and strategy. And true to his Orientalist inclinations, Giles saw the book as proof of a cultural tendency towards pacifism and an inherent disdain for military affairs, positing a sharp contrast between a pacifist China and a warlike West. But in his own time, Giles' translation did not have much impact. China's decline was accelerating. The Qing dynasty collapsed in 1911. As a result, an antiquarian's deep dive into an obscure relic of an apparently failed civilization wasn't likely to generate a lot of excitement. Today, however, stripped-down versions of the Giles are among the most popular English translations. That's partly on its merits, but primarily due to the fact that the copyright is expired. One version of it features a foreword by James Clavell, author of Shogun, who claimed, without evidence, that Mao Zedong quoted Master Sun word for word. Why Clavell made such a claim may have something to do with our final Sun Tzu translation for today, the one completed by Brigadier General Samuel B. Griffith, USMC. Griffith was a decorated Marine and a gifted linguist. He'd served and studied in China in the 1930s and then later after the war. In the 30s, he translated Mao's On Guerrilla War for an American audience. After a post-war stint at the Naval War College and a tour with NATO, Griffith retired to pursue a doctorate in Chinese studies at Oxford. As such, he's the first Western interpreter of the Sun Tzu with both military and scholarly bona fides. And his timing couldn't have been better. It was the early Cold War, and the communist victory in the Chinese Civil War, followed quickly by the Korean War, was sparking interest in Asian military thought. Griffith's approach to the Sun Tzu was that Chinese and more generally Asian strategy was fundamentally different and potentially superior to Western approaches. He was also convinced that the Sun Tzu was a definitive text, if not the definitive text, in a consistent Chinese strategic culture. These assumptions informed how he treated the book and his appended translation of the Wu Tzu, overemphasizing their points of agreement and erasing the many ways in which they diverge. But don't get me wrong, it's a fantastic translation. We assign it to our students at the War College. But I know this for a fact. Personally, translating strategic theory from one cultural and historical context into another is a fraught enterprise. accurate translation is difficult on linguistic, cultural, and historical grounds. And translators may unconsciously exaggerate the importance of a book that they've pored over for years. And we often expect that the centrality that a text holds for us is mirrored in the culture that created it. Another subplot in this drama was inter-service rivalry. Griffith's earlier work on guerrilla war was of natural interest to the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps was far more attuned to irregular warfare than the U.S. Army. The Marines often criticized Army brass for being too wedded to mass at the decisive point, ignoring more efficient approaches that Griffith saw in both the Sun Tzu and his modern disciple, Mao Zedong. As we'll see, the Sun Tzu did have a modest influence on Mao, and the communist leader occasionally quoted Master Sun, but he was far more influenced by European strategic theory. More on that later. But that didn't stop Griffith from adding an essay to his Art of War on the connections between Sun Tzu and Mao, especially on the text's natural applicability to guerrilla war. Griffith was, however, neglecting the fact that Mao's Red Army won the Chinese Civil War not through guerrilla warfare, but by conventional means, with huge mechanized formations bashing it out in positional battles, not unlike World War II on the Eastern Front. The Mao essay is therefore the least rigorous part of Griffith's translation, but it certainly helped with the sales. Another selling point was the fact that Griffith had become friends with Basil Littlehart. Remember him? He's one of the leading strategic theorists of the 20th century. And Littlehart was eager to write a foreword for his friend Sam's translation, but it wasn't pure generosity. Littlehart was a controversial figure, a British Army veteran who'd fought in the trenches on the Western Front in World War I. After that war, he argued against any future commitment of British troops to the continent, and later worked in the Chamberlain government, linking him, unfortunately, with a policy of appeasement. After World War II, Littlehart's reputation started to recover, thanks partly to his writings on what he called the indirect approach, a type of maneuver warfare in which fast-moving offensive forces avoid enemy strong points, resulting in their opponents being physically and psychologically paralyzed. Littlehart and his many fans would later claim that he'd influenced the architects of the German Blitzkrieg, especially Erwin Rommel. And although Griffith never uses the term indirect warfare, Littlehart saw in the Sun Tzu an ancient endorsement for the indirect approach, and another way to burnish his reputation as a strategic visionary. So here we have those two competing interpretations in one book. We have Griffith, who saw the Sun Tzu as a uniquely Chinese text that Western readers needed to learn from, while Littlehart saw in it a universal logic of strategy that some Westerners, particularly Karl von Clausewitz, whom many blamed for the cult of mass, had neglected. It's from Littlehart's foreword that I've drawn the phrase, concentrated essence of wisdom on the conduct of war. Ironically, both Littlehart and Griffith went to great pains to relate the Sun Tzu to the Western concept of strategy, failing to realize, for understandable reasons, thanks to Amiot and Mazerolles, this book had helped create the concept itself. To impart to Littlehart's endorsement, but equally to Griffith's fine scholarship and his crisp rendering of classical Chinese into engaging English, the translation took off. The climate was right when it came to interest in China, but the intellectual atmosphere of the 1960s was equally ripe. Akin to the military enlightenment, the early Cold War saw a renaissance in strategic thinking. The advent of nuclear weapons forced practitioners to reappraise the concept of strategy and compelled academics like me to debate war's purpose and utility. In that context, attacking an enemy's strategies and alliances seemed far more appealing than risking the thermonuclear implications of attacking their armies or their cities. As a result, programs like my own at the Naval War College began peppering their curricula with the classics of strategy, as well as with historical case studies and cutting-edge theories. Griffith's translation was central to that renaissance, and I've lost count of the number of Sun Tzu translations that have proliferated since. By the 1980s, the Sun Tzu had escaped security studies and popped up in business school curricula and American pop culture. I've also lost count of the number of TV and movie references to the text, be it The Sopranos or The Simpsons. Today, China's rise is only adding to the hunger for insight into the strategic inclinations of America's most formidable rival. We'll have more on that in our final lecture. For now, let's return to Griffith's and Little Hart's impact on strategic debates in U.S. military circles. As I mentioned, Little Hart saw a stark contrast between Sun Tzu and Clausewitz, whom we met in a previous lecture. Clausewitz is unfairly blamed for the cult of mass, with Little Hart styled the direct approach, where the essence of strategy is massing your forces for a series of decisive blows at the enemy's center of gravity. You'll remember that Clausewitz was also something of an intelligence pessimist, where the Sun Tzu implies that gathering and processing intelligence at all levels of war is an essential element of strategic success. Clausewitz counters that a general is bombarded with so much, often conflicting information and misinformation, that trying to process it all only results in strategic paralysis. In the fog of war, Clausewitz thinks you're better off relying on mass, intuition, and audacity than on schemes involving elaborate espionage and deception. For Little Hart and many American students of Sun Tzu, this counterposing of the art of war and Clausewitz's on war creates a false dichotomy between the direct and indirect approach, as well as between the strategic orthodoxy of hidebound institutions and the unorthodox approaches advocated by renegades trying to transform those institutions. One of those renegades was Air Force Colonel John Boyd. Although Boyd never committed his complete thoughts on war and strategy to paper, his lectures and assorted notes have become deeply influential, albeit not with the United States Air Force, but with Griffith's Marine Corps. Boyd was deeply critical of both Air Force and Army doctrine. He saw it as excessively orthodox and Clausewitzian, fixating on the enemy's center of gravity and pummeling it with massed firepower, pathology that many saw as the cause of America's defeat in Vietnam. In contrast, the Marine Corps' seminal text, Warfighting, enshrines what Boyd called the OODA loop, the process of observing a tactical or strategic situation, orienting, that is, assessing the relative strengths and weaknesses of each side, deciding what to do, and finally acting. It's called a loop because after the culminating action, the engagement isn't necessarily over, and another observe, orient, decide, and act cycle may follow. Such a rapid melding of intelligence, intuition, and judgment, however, might be seen as impeding the rational scientific mindset favored in the West, a mindset which seems to fixate on elaborate pre-war planning. Boyd's debt to the Sun Tzu is obvious. At the same time, he wasn't a complete Clausewitz hater. He admired the Prussians' deep thinking about strategy. But Clausewitz's default to mass to compensate for the nearly impenetrable fog of war had led Clausewitz's followers to neglect how a clever combatant could know the enemy, know themselves, know the weather, and know the terrain. And while he himself was far from a complete intel optimist, Boyd nonetheless argued that contemporary revolutions in sensors, intelligence gathering, targeting, and especially precision-guided munitions could allow modern strategists to penetrate the fog of war. So Boyd creates a theory to help complex systems rapidly adapt in hostile and seemingly chaotic environments. He was anticipating the shock and awe campaign that toppled Saddam Hussein in 2003. Many officers today, especially Marines, place Boyd on a pedestal next to Master Sun, a modern visionary of essential strategic truths first captured on those bamboo slips over 2,000 years ago. As you can probably guess, I'm a bit skeptical of hagiography like this regarding both Sun Tzu and John Boyd. But in all honesty, I really can't complain. The extent to which the US military has become enthralled with the art of war, especially the Griffith Little Hart version, is a big reason why I have such a great day job. And the fact that the Sun Tzu has become synonymous with strategy, whether it is uniquely Chinese or universal, might be one of the reasons that you signed up for this course. So for that, thank you.